Last July, we were excited for the Senate to pass the $1 billion Boondoggle Act, requiring the exposing of government projects, any government project that's over $1 billion over budget or 5 years behind schedule. Noticing $1 billion took a bill. And not even a year later, DOGE arrives to crawl up the channels of federal spending and take a look around. What timing to have Mark Moyar with us tonight. Just yesterday, after 6 weeks of inspection of the USAID, Secretary Rubio announced that 5,200 of the 6,200 programs of the agency will be eliminated. That's 83% of the money for the Agency for International Development getting cut, and the remaining 18% deemed worthy will be assigned to be administered under the State Department. From 2018 to 2019, Mark Moyar served as the director of the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation at the USAID. Have you all seen those images of that blob of garbage, that floating debris, floating island of debris? It's like twice the size of Texas, right? Picture that with poisonous snakes, okay? That is what I imagined as I read what Mark navigated, and we pray will be remedied soon. Mark, in fact, calls it bureaucratic jujitsu. By its existence, his detailed account of retaliation for whistleblowing by a former government employee is itself actually a weapon against tyranny. Before it was recently confirmed by the efforts of DOGE that the USAID thinks of us as their personal ATM machines, Mark stood up for integrity and transparency at the department. He thinks that the American people deserve the truth about how our money is spent and how the president was being sabotaged. And for that, he is paying a significant price. I will note that tonight's speaker does not, I repeat, does not identify as a white female of Scandinavian heritage, even though he was forced to do so at a USAID DEI training. Previously, he directed the project on military and diplomatic history at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and taught at the U.S. Marine Corps University, the Joint Special Operations University, and Texas A&M. He's the author of 8 books on military history, diplomatic history, grand strategy, leadership, and international development. I'm very pleased to share that he has joined Hillsdale, and he is the William P. History Chair in Military History currently. He also is involved in the Military History Working Group at Hoover with one of our favorites, Victor Davis Hanson. All over the news since the DOGE dust up, and joining us here in California tonight to let you know not just how the sausage is made, but how it is cut, sold, and stolen. Please welcome Dr. Mark Moyar.
Thanks, Jean, for that generous introduction. Thanks to Paul and Alex and others here who have helped make this possible. It's great to be here with you on this Tuesday evening. So I'm going to talk a bit about my time at USAID and also some broader issues and what this means for us, what it means for concerned citizens. So I'll first just begin with a very brief background. So when the book was first written, I actually proposed calling it Agency for International Corruption, and the publisher said, well, nobody knows what USAID is really, so let's not call it that. And it wasn't really till late January that suddenly everybody's talking about USAID. And the agency was created by John F. Kennedy in 1961, but U.S. foreign aid goes back a bit further. So this is a chart of U.S. foreign aid by year. You'll see it actually very high at the beginning, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when the Marshall Plan was used to rebuild Europe. And there was a period after that when people said, well, hey, Marshall Plan works so great, let's take foreign aid elsewhere and it'll have the same effect. and we'll pretty soon be out of the aid business. Well, as you can see, we're still very much in the aid business because it turns out most of the rest of the world is not like Western Europe. And you'll see on the right, far right there, there's a spike, and that's largely driven by the Ukraine war. So here's a diagram or list of where aid was going in fiscal year 23. So you see Ukraine is by far the biggest recipient. Now, fortunately, it's not known for its corruption, so there's really nothing to worry about there. And this is going to certainly be revisited soon. And there was, by the way, in case you didn't hear it, Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire today, which is interesting because we kept being told that Trump is going to start World War III and Ukraine's going to blow up. So certainly we're going to see some change here, and I think also American people have recognized that we probably don't need to be giving so much aid to certain countries. So I'll talk a bit, and this was already referenced a little bit in the introduction. So this was this isn't the actual image, but this is the first day I joined USAID in February 2018. And we had this orientation. Now, they didn't have an orientation for all the new political appointees, which is what they should have had. Instead, we had a general employee orientation, which was for all new employees. So it was political appointees and career staff and contractors. So, and I'd never heard of this thing before. It turns out it's called a privilege walk. And you're each given an identity. And so mine happened to be, it was white female of Scandinavian descent. And so that was my role I had to play. And then we had the male French development official. We had the transgender prostitute and the indigenous woman with unwanted child, et cetera. So you stand in a line, and then they read something like, people discriminate against me, or people overcharge me for good, all these different things. So at the end of it, make a long story short, the white male guy's at the front, and I'm second, being the white female, and then all the other groups are behind us, and so this shows you who has privilege, and then of course we had to talk about our privilege and why our privilege is controlled by society and we have no control over our fates. So this kind of craziness was not outlawed until 2020. This is one of the very big important differences between the first Trump term and the second Trump term. The first Trump term, there was not a lot of organization. This was over a year into the first Trump term at this point, and they still have DEI training going on. So if you've noticed in recent weeks, that's one of the first things that got hammered. But in USAID in general, we had very few political appointees during the entire year. So basically, the bureaucracy was running the agency, and this is an important lesson that has been learned. So just a bit more about how this process works. A lot of people aren't familiar with this. So I was a political appointee. There was about 4,000 total in the government, and that means roughly for every political appointee, there are 1,000 career federal employees. And I'm sure you know, if you've been in a big organization, one person can't really keep a very good track of 1,000 other people. So that was one of the first challenges we had. Now, I will say some of those political appointees are in leadership positions, which you'd think would make it somewhat easier. But again, if you've been in a large organization, you know hiding stuff from the leaders may not be that difficult. This was the political situation. This is for the federal government as a whole. I think the USA is actually worse. But in 2016, out of the federal career workforce, 95% gave to Hillary Clinton, and 5% to Donald Trump. Now, of course, career bureaucrats are supposed to be nonpartisan, and that's what we're told. When I got there, I'll say certainly find out that it's not always the case. Now, I will say there's some who do what they're supposed to do. They don't get involved in politics, but many of them do. So I'll give a few examples. So this was one thing I had not heard about, but turned out to be pretty influential. It's called the Truman National Security Project. And you'll see there it has some very famous members of its board: Kamala Harris, Jake Sullivan, Ron Klain, all the way down to Hunter Biden. And so what this organization does is has programs to basically help Democrats who are career bureaucrats to gain skills, get jobs, gain influence. And so when we started looking at who are the career bureaucrats who are causing us the most trouble, a lot of them were affiliated with this organization. Another thing we saw is what's called burrowing in, which means that you were a political appointee in the Obama administration and you managed to get a career job. Now, the rules say you have to be there at least a year prior to the next administration. So these people had to have become career employees by the beginning of 2016. But turned out a lot of them did, including the woman who was in charge of the management bureau for the agency, which controls the money. So you had a Democrat running the bureau that handles money for most of the Trump administration. This was an infamous video that surfaced near the end of the Trump administration, and it's not just particular to USAID, but USAID has a special place in it. And you can actually find this video online. It's pretty shocking if you watch it. And one of the main people talking is a USAID employee. Basically, they had this Zoom session to talk about how can we get in the way of the Trump administration. And these are career bureaucrats who aren't supposed to be doing that. But here, I've circled, this was a quote from this USAID official, and he says, you probably can't read it, if a transition team comes in next week, and this was when it wasn't clear who was going to win the election, if a transition team comes in next week, is there a way to work with them that would slow roll the damage that this administration will do in the last few months? So this individual, and he appears so we know who he is, some of the Trump appointees at USAID went to the Office of Security at USAID and said, we have a video here online of a career bureaucrat talking about sabotaging the Trump administration. Pretty egregious offense. And the Office of Security, which is run by career bureaucrats, didn't do anything about it. And this guy continued to work for a long time after. And I'll get back to the Office of Security in a minute because they're pretty important. So what are some of the areas where the career bureaucrats got in the way of the Trump administration? So one of the things I saw, and this was from going out to Africa in 2018, again, we didn't have a lot of political appointees, so I would go to a lot of places where USAID had been running for 18 or more months without political appointees showing up. So I got there and I was asking them about faith-based programs. And this was a priority for the first Trump administration. There was a belief among Trump appointees that if we're going to be funding international development, we should probably channel at least some of that money through faith-based organizations, and oftentimes they are more efficient and less corrupt than some others. So when I got there, I was told that, USA is not doing that because it violates the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. Now, this is a gross misreading of the Constitution that had been pushed by Obama appointees as an excuse to not fund these religious groups, and a lot of that was motivated by the fact that there's a strong LGBTQ lobby or element within USAID that does not like Christianity in particular for that reason. So I reported that. Eventually, the agency leadership actually took action on this and went out, sent out memos across the agency, but it took close to 2 years before that was rectified. Another example, I was at a meeting in the middle of 2018, it's again about a year and a half into the administration, and I heard career official talking about how there were important, we call humanitarian assistance programs in Syria, and they were trying to figure out how to hide them from the president because Trump might not like these programs. Now, this also is gross insubordination. I mean, it was actually remarkable that I heard it. Again, they had been running basically without supervision for a year and a half and forgot who the political appointees were. So, and by the way, this is one of the problems you have with USAID. When you talk about humanitarian assistance, can mean a lot of things, and oftentimes it's not quite as nice as we would think. So in the case of Syria, you have a civil war going on. we're putting money in there that's supposed to be for life-saving purposes, but we know some of that gets stolen by the bad guys. There's a lot of bad people running around with guns in Syria. It also means that we are absolving countries we don't like Iran and Russia, of the need to put money into these places. So I reported this as well, and in this case, the senior USAID political appointee actually sat on it, and he never explained why. I think it's because he was afraid of the career bureaucrats, so nothing was done on that. Now, the thing that really got me in trouble involved a conflict of interest. And one of the things, if you've been watching the news, you've seen a lot about the transgender operas and the DEI coloring books and all this crazy stuff that's going on. And there's a good amount of that. But the most flagrant corruption really involves contracting. And this is, of course, not a new problem. But people are not siphoning money straight out of the bank accounts of USAID. That might be pretty easy to catch. So what happens is that you have people steering contracts and huge contracts to their friends. So in this instance, that diagram on the left, so I was the head of this office. The person below there, he was my deputy, and I was recently appointed to this position. And so as soon as I get there, people are complaining, this guy, his name's Mick Cernovich, he said, Mick, he is the chairman of the board of a contracting company while he's working for the government. There's something wrong with that. So I said, well, it does seem kind of weird. And I got some more information. So I went to the HR officials, and they said, yeah, well, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Yeah, it's good you want to do something. In truth, what usually happens is managers here just ignore that stuff. So that was one of the most ominous signs. So you face this decision of, are you going to duck responsibility, which is the easy route, which is what most people are doing, or do you actually want to take responsibility, which seems to be a lot more perilous? And I didn't know at the time just how perilous it was, but that's a good part of why people aren't reporting this stuff, is that you don't get punished for ignoring the corruption. You get in trouble if you actually draw attention to it. So I report it, and then the bureaucracy comes after me. Took a little while. I won't go into all the details. You can see this in the book, but there's a section about a book I'd written 2 years earlier called Oppose Any Foe. And the long and short of it, it'd been published 2 years earlier. The government had plenty of time to review it, never said anything. And then 2 years later, somebody accuses me anonymously. Well, their name's not known to me. They say, oh, that book contains classified information. And the information I was given didn't say what this supposedly was or why the government had a chance to try to stop it and didn't do anything. But in the meantime, now we're back to the Office of Security. So what the Office of Security can do is suspend your security clearance. Now, what they told me at the time was, well, we've only received an allegation, and we're going to investigate this. And if you are found guilty, you can appeal this process. Now, I later found out they're really not supposed to suspend your clearance if they don't yet have any supporting evidence, and all sorts of people do bad things and nothing happens to their security clearance. But if they want to get you, this is one of the preferred methods to do so. And these are two of the senior career bureaucrats here. John Voorhees on the left, the director of the office, and you'll see him again in a bit. So I was suspended, put on administrative leave, and taken out of my office. Now, this was something I found out a bit later, but this again is indication of how terrible the place was in some respects. So the Office of Security, well, first of all, they deal with security clearance issues, which can often weaponized. There's no political appointees there to watch what's going on. Now, this was particularly shocking. This was 2 years before, or 3 years before I was accused. they had fired the entire senior leadership of this group, plus somebody from the FBI, plus somebody from the Inspector General. Now, I've still not been able to get the documentation on this, and it's rather remarkable that no one has actually gotten the documentation, but we do know that all these people got fired because the FBI investigated this office because they were accusing people of being foreign spies. And it turned out they were using this to go after their personal enemies. The fact that you have so many dishonest people in such an important office is, I think, testament to the magnitude of the problems. Now, another thing I should say about this office, in addition to the security clearances, they are responsible for what's called partner vetting. And that means if we're giving money to some group in Syria, 'cause the way USAID works is USAID is basically a big contract and grant organization. It has, I think then it was something like $25 billion. It's like $42 billion a year now, at least until very recently. And so they basically give out either a grant or a contract where you have to meet certain conditions to what they call their implementing partners. And this is usually a contractor or an NGO. A lot of times it's an NGO or it's a UN organization. But they're supposed to be partner vetting because when this NGO or UN gets the money, they have to find some local people to actually do the work or get the aid where it needs to go. So the Office of Security is supposed to look at these recipient groups and say, are there any terrorists here, any drug dealers, any money launderers? And so this group here, some of the worst of the worst, they were supposed to be doing this. We know now that in many cases they weren't doing that, or they were giving out waivers. So this is, again, another reason why people have become so suspicious about USAID and how it actually spends its money. Now, another thing I ran into during this process, which I hadn't really fully understood, was what we like to call the aid industrial complex, which is, you've often heard of the military-industrial complex referenced by President Eisenhower, but there's also a big aid industrial complex. And these are the four big pillars, if you will, within the aid industrial complex. So the upper left are federal agencies. USAID is the most well-known, but there's a number of others, Millennium Challenge, Peace Corps, for example. To the right are the contractors. These for-profits or NGOs or UN organizations who are getting all this money from USAID and these other agencies. Below that you have Congress. So Congress is the one that actually allocates the money to USAID. They have the power of the purse. And then you have lobbyists who are going to Congress and saying, you've really got to spend more money on this. And there is a great deal of incestuousness among these groups and people moving back and forth. And this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to try to cut aid spending and why you've seen a much more drastic approach in the second term. So how this is directly relevant is that one of the USAID officials who's shown there, Bonnie Glick, who actually was a political appointee, who should never been a political appointee. So she's married to the top lobbyist shown here, the top lobbyist for the aid industry. So again, massive conflict of interest. The lawyers should not have allowed this. We had a guy who I referenced repeatedly in the book he's technically the agency ethics official, but he's known colloquially as the unethical ethics attorney. So he allows a lot of this stuff to go on, and in return, I think Bonnie Glick gives him favors and does nice things for him. So turns out I had made myself an enemy of Bonnie Glick because she's got a big conflict of interest, and I'm reporting conflicts of interest. So they conduct this investigation. I get interviewed in the middle of it, and I'm told, and we have later follow-up that says they don't have any evidence. The Department of Defense person who reported me didn't actually turn over evidence. I didn't have any opportunity to see what this was. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm in pretty good shape because, how can you have done something wrong if they don't want to produce any evidence? Well, turns out they can do things to you anyway. So at the end, they say, you were fired. And so I'm like, well, explain. So there are things called constitutional rights, which, until your constitutional rights are jeopardized or abridged, you often don't pay that much attention to them. But now that I was paying attention, it turns out there were 4 different constitutional rights they violated in the process of firing me. So one was, and of course they didn't tell me this, I had to find this out later, and as a federal employee, some of your rights are abridged, but you still have constitutional rights. So the first one they violated was the First Amendment, because their First Amendment says that even if you're a government employee, even if you sign a non-disclosure agreement, you have free speech rights, and you have, if someone's going to accuse you of something, you can then challenge them. Again, no evidence provided there. Fourth Amendment, against illegal search and seizure. So one of the other things they did was they seized my computer, and we later found out they did this based on an office rumor that somebody overheard. Now, we also know they didn't find anything incriminating on the computer, but nonetheless, they did it, which again, you're not supposed to do search and seizure like that without a legitimate cause. So Fifth Amendment, this one's particularly problematic. So Fifth Amendment gives you due process rights, which means if there's somebody accuses you of something, they have to show you what the evidence is. So if I accuse you of publishing classified information, I have to actually say what that is. Now, so this here is the ethics official guy I mentioned earlier. He said, when this later comes up, he says, well, because it came from another agency, we have to treat it as gospel, which is, again, about as ludicrous as you can get. There's no such thing as gospel in the federal government, and certainly not in due process. You can't just say, oh, well, this distinguished gentleman over here is so reputable that we have to trust him. So that's what they're claiming. And then Sixth Amendment, confront your accuser. So they still 5 years later, we're trying to find out who this person is. We do know as a 2-star general, so that's one of the things they use. Well, 2-star general who, therefore must be unimpeachable ethics, which is also, again, ridiculous. All right, so I want to mention, too, Pete Morocco, because you've probably, if you've paid attention to the news, you've seen him a lot in the news. He is basically the acting head of USAID, or what's left of it. But Pete Morocco came to USAID right after, or shortly after I got fired. And he actually was put into the same part of the agency that I was. And they went after him, the bureaucracy, and they went to the press. And you may be shocked to know that most of the Washington press sides with the liberal bureaucrats over the Trump appointees. So they put out all these nasty stories about him. The one big thing that they focused on was that he wants to cut government programs that don't fit the Trump foreign policy, which is actually what political appointees are supposed to do. But they made a big deal about this. And eventually, it became so heated that he's forced to take a 3-month, take a leave of absence. And thanks to this media pressure, he ultimately will have to leave the agency. Now, if you want to know why this particular guy is doing a lot to cut the agency, you can look at what happened to him in the first term. All right, so in the book, I talk a bit about sort of resilience and dealing with adversity. I won't go into all this here, but faith, family, country, these are important things you need in times of difficulty, and these are also the same things that motivated me in the first place to take a stand against corruption. So now I'm going to talk about the whistleblower protection policy, because this, again, you think, okay, well, there's some bad parts of the government, but, there's a whistleblower protection person, so surely they must be able to help me. So I go to this guy, and he comes up with this crazy excuse as to why I'm not qualified to be a whistleblower. And he says, well, the process wasn't complete, and blah, blah, blah. So this was an excuse that we knew to be false. So eventually gets shot down. So then it goes to this other person, and she claims that I voluntarily resigned. Now, to make a long story short, they fired me, and then a lawyer said, well, sign a a resignation letter because it'll look better on your record, but it's not a voluntary resignation. But again, they threw out this crazy excuse. So the people who are supposed to protect whistleblowers are trying to claim you're not a whistleblower. And this is part of the Office of Inspector General. I learned more about them too. They are a big part of the problem at USAID and a lot of other places. Now, this was a problem that in the first Trump term we didn't really address. It wasn't until 2020 that they really started addressing it. This time, if you pay attention to the news, they fired 17 inspector generals in the first week. So this again, and if you saw, I don't know if any of you watched 60 Minutes, but 60 Minutes a couple nights ago, they had these, including the former USAID Inspector General, and they were giving us sob stories about these poor watchdogs are, they've been fired from their jobs, and it's so unfair. Now everyone can be corrupt. And so the point is that these people, a lot of them were already corrupt. In fact, when your IG is corrupt, that means the whole entity is going to be corrupt. So here are two of the people who were there before, well, first one before I got there, Michael Carroll on the left, and then Ann Calvary-Zibar, who was there when I dealt with them. So this is for Michael Carroll, and this is the Washington Post. This is not, some fringe publication. This is the liberal Washington Post. They reported on Mike Carroll in 2014 that he had removed damaging information from Inspector General reports. Now, again, Inspector Generals are supposed to be the people who safeguard waste, fraud, and abuse. So when the IG is deleting hundreds of instances of corruption from those reports, that's a big problem. And explanation later came out was he was basically trying to curry favor because he was the acting IG. He wanted to become the IG. And what better way to become the IG than to sanitize the report so the agency looks better? He gets caught, some whistleblowers report him, and he ultimately gets run out of the agency, although the whistleblowers who reported him also get run out by his successor. This is another good example I like to give of how bad the Inspector General system was working. And this refers to OPIC. This was another of the implementing partners, or one of the federal agencies. But they fall under the USAID Office of Inspector General. So I'll read it here for in case it's difficult to read. It says, this is from a report, a senior employee of OPIC was married to an employee of a company that won 2 OPIC contracts valued at $987,000. Senior employee failed to disclose her relationship prior to participating in 2 OPIC technical evaluation boards and twice failed to complete a standard conflict of interest disclosure statement. So in other words, senior bureaucrat, she's married to a guy at a company that wins $1 million in federal contracts, and she doesn't tell anybody that she's married to him. And she was asked this in 2 forms twice, and she didn't put it in. So now, if this happened in a local government, probably people would go to jail. Certainly people would be getting fired. Well, here's what actually happens to this individual. A letter of reprimand which requires remedial ethics training. So this is why you have a culture of impunity. You do something that egregious and you have to go take a training course. So another thing, I'm just touching on some of the highlights. So who comes in when Joe Biden wins to run USAID? Samantha Power. Now, you may remember her from the unmasking of General Flynn, when as UN ambassador, who shouldn't have anything to do with these intelligence matters, is unmasking Michael Flynn dozens of times, later comes out in Congress, and this is used to destroy General Flynn and support the so-called Russiagate hoax. So she's put into USAID, and so Senator Charles Grassley at this point is supporting me, and he sends her a request to get more information about my case. And her response is simply, well, the Inspector General already looked at it, and they didn't find anything wrong, so can't help you there. And now this is a broader pattern we've seen, and we saw in the Biden administration. So when the Senate flipped, Grassley's no longer a chair, and so the Democrats take this position. If you're not a chair, we're not going to give you information. Now, Senator Ron Wyden was the Democrat on the Whistleblower Protection Caucus, so we went to him, because, of course, Senator Wyden, you say this is not a partisan issue. But years go by, and Senator Wyden doesn't do anything. So we don't get anything from Samantha Power. So July of 2020, they restore my security clearance. Which again, if I publish classified information, pretty hard to do that. But then they try to come after me on a different ground on December 23rd, 2020, which same day they tell us my son has cancer, which is obviously a pretty crappy day. So I was supposed to go in the Trump administration near the end of the first one. When that doesn't happen, they say, well, we can't review your clearance, it's put on hold. So we had to go through the process again. Then December of 2021, they come back again with this very dubious claim, trying to come after my clearance. Well, this time they're not even saying we're going to revoke it. They're saying, well, you're going to have to go talk to a judge. So there's an executive order in the government, which, I thought these things were important. It says, okay, if you're going to try to take someone's security clearance, you have to produce documents, records, investigative file. So you have due process. So my lawyer submits a request, okay, send us the documents that support whatever your latest ridiculous charge is. They come back and say, you're not going to get it. And if any of you remember Caddyshack, this is one of my favorite scenes, you'll get nothing and like it. And this comes from DOD, USAID, and DOJ, who's now helping them out. And so I sued him in February 2022, saying basically you have to follow your own rules. And this is still in the court system. So justice is not moving quickly here. Some other points. So try to get help from the media, because one thing a lot of these craven bureaucrats fear is media exposure. So went and talked to a number of media outlets, and my lawyer thought, well, hey, why don't we try to get some of the big liberal outlets, because then they will get a lot of attention, and then they can't claim this is a partisan issue. So, okay, so we go to New York Times and Foreign Policy magazine. And there's two reporters at both places say, wow, this is very compelling story. I can't believe what's going on. So they interview a bunch of people, write up their stories, and then they send them to the editors. And the editors say, this just isn't interesting enough for us. And so we know, certainly Foreign Policy, they don't want a story that makes a Trump appointee look good. They just don't. So the one reporter who really did a good job was Susan Crabtree of Real Clear Politics. And I mention it because partly she actually just today has a book out called Fool's Gold about crooked politicians in California, which you may be interested in. I believe her co-author is going to be speaking here later. So it's a book to keep your eye on. But so she actually did write a very good article that helped. But again, you need to have multiple outlets, and these liberal outlets simply, they don't want to report things that don't fit a certain political narrative. So was I the only person? No, there are quite a few Trump appointees who they try to destroy with the security clearance process. Here are two of them. Adam Lovinger got in the news a good amount, and he actually published a book recently about his experience, and he was at the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, and the Office of Net Assessment was funding a guy named Stephen Halper. If you recall the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, Stephen Halper is trying to entrap Trump appointees. So he reports this, among other things. Why is this Pentagon agency supporting this fraudulent guy? And also Halper had like over $1 million in contracts and couldn't produce evidence that he'd done the work. Michael Pillsbury was also in that office, and he's written a great book called The 100-Year Marathon about U.S. competition with China. They went after his clearance. Couple more. Katie Arrington. She was a senior DOD official. They come after her clearance because she was put into a career job. She now is back at the Pentagon. And Michael Ellis, another one, he's actually going back to the CIA with Trump. So you can see people who got victimized are now going back in to help fix some of these matters. And I was, by the way, I was asked to go back into the administration at USAID, but unfortunately my son is continuing to battle cancer, and so that just did not work for our family. But I really wish I could have been able to do that. Then we also have the FBI whistleblowers you may be familiar with. How did they go after these guys? Security clearance. And the process for security clearances are often kind of opaque, and they can drag them on. I think Marcus Allen, I think he was on leave for over 2 years without them resolving his case, and finally they had to give him back pay. But of course, this isn't a partisan issue, right? It happens to Democrats all the time. Well, actually, no. We have some very prominent Democrats who did crazy things that shouldn't have security clearance, and yet they're senior officials in the Biden administration. So Colin Cowell is one. He was accused, and Republicans came after him for tweeting classified information. Again, no problem for him. Jake Sullivan, you may remember him for putting classified information on Hillary Clinton's email server. And at the time, even liberal Democrats said, well, there's no way he's ever going to get a security clearance again. But lo and behold, he's the national security advisor for Joe Biden. So what can we do? Well, a lot of the problems identified in here, people have already acted upon, and it's not a coincidence that USAID was the first agency they went after because it is among the most egregious offenders. Now, more broadly, we have certainly, the smaller the government is, the less corruption there's going to be. It's simply the case. If you have $42 billion in money you're giving out to people, you're going to have more corruption than if you only have $5 billion. And so we're seeing that, as was mentioned, 83% of USAID's funding has been cut. Now, there's still an open question as to what's going to happen with that because it's in the courts, and Congress had passed this impoundment law, which says executive branch can't just not spend the money. So we're going to see how that gets resolved because the administration, I think, is taking the position that the Impoundment Act is actually unconstitutional, so probably end up in the Supreme Court. Another thing that needs to be done, which DOJ has also been involved in this, is reining in the federal bureaucracy. Now, getting rid of a lot of bureaucrats helps, and certainly with cutting money, you can cut bureaucrats, but there's still going to be a federal bureaucracy. And so you need to be able to get control of it, and that means getting good political appointees, which I said there were some very bad political appointees the first Trump term. And that's another lesson that's been learned because they spent the last 4 years trying to find people to serve as political appointees. So even though there's not a lot of appointees, if you have ones who know what they're doing, and that was another problem I would say too. Some of the people who were assigning these agencies didn't know the agency. And if you don't know the agency, it's easy to have the wool pulled over your head. And it's easy to get sucked in because what the bureaucrats will try to do is they'll say, oh, Mr. Smith, you are just the most remarkable and intelligent person I've ever met. You were doing such a wonderful job. And then, so this guy, if he's, your average schmo, will say, oh, well, thank you, that's great. I love this praise, and you know what? You guys go do whatever you want to do. And so the bureaucrats go do what they do. So you have to have people who are not going to play that game. Instilling an ethical culture, this is a more basic problem, but a place like USAID, culture starts with leadership, and I've spent a lot of time in other contexts looking at this, but these are just a few examples of leaders who really said this is a priority. Again, when I did orientation at USAID, there was nobody talking about ethical culture except here a few rules don't break, but nobody said, this isn't going to be tolerated, we're going to back you up, please report the corruption, and we're going to take complaints seriously. Another big thing that needs to be done is just basically destroying the Inspector General system as we know it. As I said, Trump fired many of the leaders, and it's a good step. That is the best thing to do in the near term, and then we've got to get some good people in there. But in the long term, you really need to just blow the whole thing up because what you have, the Inspectors General are tied to the agencies right now. And if you're tied to the agency, there's a good chance you'll see what we've seen before at USAID, which is that the people who are supposed to be watching end up getting too cozy with the ones they're watching. And there's also not a good super oversight mechanism. So that's one of the big things that needs to happen. More broadly, in terms of culture, I do think culture plays an important role in public ethics. And we have especially in higher education, we have left-wing dogmas being pushed on students that are not helping and in many respects hurting. Here are a couple of examples. John Rawls, sort of the most famous liberal intellectual, to speak on these, very utilitarian and secular. Ibrahim X. Kendi, one of the fathers of critical race theory, which I'm sure I don't have to explain to you why that is a toxic ideology. And so we need to get back, in my view, to the core texts of the Western civilization. And said I joined Hillsdale recently. One of the reasons I joined Hillsdale is that we still teach these texts, which in the past have been the path to virtue for Americans. And unfortunately, most colleges and universities, you don't have to take this. I mean, even when I was an undergrad in the 90s, they had started to make it so you just had to take distribution requirements. So if you wanted to take a course on, cross-dressing, you could do that instead of taking, the core of Western civilization. So this is something we need to push in to the greatest extent we can. And by the way, you probably heard also they're cutting like half the Department of Education. It just came out, so another positive development, I think. And so, yeah, so hopefully there will be some good changes in terms of curriculum. It's limited how much we want to do, but certainly some room for improvement and getting rid of, the DEI that's infiltrated education. And lastly, I won't go into great detail, but and you've seen this in the news, but in terms of epilogue, as I said, USAID gets targeted immediately. John Voorhees, I mentioned earlier, he ends up being in the headlines. He's in this headline here: USAID security leaders removed after refusing Elon Musk's Doge employees access to secure systems. So Voorhees is the main guy targeted in there. This is the end of, or beginning of February. Doge went to the Office of Security and said, we want to access your files. And he said, no, you can't do that. So they ended up calling the U.S. Marshals Service to come, and Voorhees ends up getting removed from his position, along with some other bad characters. So they have removed all of the most serious egregious offenders. I mean, one other thing that still needs to be seen, not just here but at other agencies, is who's going to be this federal workforce of the future. And there's a good video on this. Hillsdale had a roundtable with Russ Vogt and me and another person back in September, and Russ Vogt in there talks about how they want a federal workforce of at-will employees, because right now you have unionized employees for the most part who are almost impossible to fire. It's like in a teacher's union. You can't get rid of anybody. And so that is obviously not a good way, efficient way to run things. So I think what you're going to see at USAID and elsewhere is after they cut all these unionized employees, they will bring people back as at-will employees. Again, that's another battle I think that was still going to be playing out there. So I will stop there and be happy to take your questions.
I want to start just with a comment and a question about greed, because clearly challenging the integrity of our government is stirring up a hornet's nest. We've got Tesla terrorists, we've got union outrage, we've got doxing, we've got some really ugly stuff going on. And it seems like this is pretty much what the Founding Fathers were concerned about when we don't have control over the government. I think that I want to ask you, Mark, about greed, because this is the lust for power. It's part of the human condition. It's not going anywhere. Probably many of our Christian audience members are thinking about the temptation of greed for power that maybe during this season of Lent. But we all have it in us. And I bet if you think about it, 3/4 of the women in this audience, if they were truthful, would say that they really want to have power over how their dishwashers are loaded. Right? It's just our nature. So are you optimistic about our system of check and balances being able to contain the human nature?
That's a great question. And one thing, since you mentioned the founders, one thing I like to point out to students, and by the way, we actually make our students read the Constitution, which again is now an anomaly. But if you look in there, you'll see when the Congress was created, they were supposed to meet 1 day per year. So imagine a government where Congress only met 1 day. They would never have imagined the behemoth that we have now in our federal government. As you mentioned, there is I think, relatively fixed human nature. We're all flawed to some extent, and that was a big part of the founding, was based on the idea that humans are inherently flawed, and so we have to have checks and balances and protections against these things. And our system has been able to survive longer than just about any other for that reason. But you do have, and I think that's partly what you're seeing with the current administration, there's a belief that the bureaucracy has gotten so out of control and spending's gotten so out of control that we need to have some more drastic solutions. And I think we're still seeing that play out. I mean, one thing, too, I would mention, because I've just written an article about this, but we have the Inspectors General have something called the CIGIE, C-I-G-I-E, and it is supposed to oversee the Inspectors General. And what you have there is basically a denial of what the founders believe, that basically what they said is, you Inspectors General, you get to police yourselves. And because you must be virtuous people. Well, it's been a disaster, and Congress, I think, is going to do something about it. But when you put government people in charge, even people who may be fairly well-meaning, you can't trust them to police themselves. And so that's part, again, what the problem with bureaucracy is. There's oftentimes not enough oversight. Now, if you get better leaders, things will get better. But again, we're never going to reach utopia because we are humans.
Why do appointees, political appointees, have different rules about being whistleblowers? And is that going to change in this administration? That's
a good question. I do think it should change because you have fewer protections as a political appointee, which is a disincentive to political appointees to take risks. And so that is something that I've been encouraging, is that they get the same protections as other federal employees. I will say, even for other federal employees, the protections are not very good, because I've gotten to know a lot of whistleblowers through this process, and most of them think the protections are not adequate. Most of them did not get much money, if any, for all the damage, because the government's very good, as I said. The people who are supposed to protect whistleblowers seem to be very good at preventing you from actually claiming whistleblower status.
Two things that struck me as very strange in your book. One was that you told me that new employees were told, just work on what you're interested in. I was astonished as a taxpayer. Just work on what you're interested in. What if I'm interested in, hanging out in my bed and eating donuts? I just thought that was really strange. And then the lack of accountability once people are caught doing these things, they're just transferred to another department. Could you talk about the corruption the culture?
Yes, those are both great questions. And there are, you probably won't be shocked to know that there are a lot of excess employees in the federal government. At least there have been. And so what I've seen now, there are some employees who have a full load on their plate and actually doing important stuff all day long. But you have a lot of people who aren't. And a lot of that, and I didn't fully appreciate this until it's into the government, but if you look at how the bureaucracy incentivizes people, what is it to get promoted as a bureaucrat? You need to supervise a lot of people and a lot of money. And that means a lot of people are going to say, I need more money and more people, even if I really don't. And so you have a lot of that going on. And I've seen that not only at USAID, but in the Department of Defense. I worked at Special Operations Command for a while. There was a general consensus that the civilian workforce there was twice the size it needed to be. And another part of this, what was the second part of the question?
Just sort of the culture of no accountability, and they get transferred.
So I also saw this in Department of Defense. If you did something really bad, corrupt, it's so hard to fire you. People are not going to take the time to do that. So you get sent to what is called the Hall of Misfit Toys, where they put you in office and you literally don't do anything. But the taxpayer is paying for this because you're still a federal employee. And so, that's part of the problem with the unionized workforce, is you just can't get rid of all these non-productive employees.
How completely crazy is that? All right, we need a palate cleanser. I just want to say that if you're sitting in the back, if you could keep your voices down, because I know it doesn't sound like much, but it actually travels up here to the stage. So who decides what projects are approved and funded? And let's talk about the role of NGOs. Does the NGO money circle back to Congress people? And if so, how does that happen?
Yeah, so those are good questions. As far as what gets funded, one of the problems in the first Trump term, again, we very much struggled to do this. There were already all these programs in place that dated back to the Obama administration, and you had Congress paying for these. And I will say, Republicans in Congress bear some of the blame for this, because they, even those who talk about limited government, a lot of them want to keep spending lots of money, which is why the deficit keeps going up. So they were saying, we're going to spend this money. So USAID had to spend the money. Again, the first term, they did not take the position that we didn't have to spend the money. The agency leaders said, okay, we got to spend the money. And so then you have these boards, and you have these panels of experts, mostly career bureaucrats, and they decide which of these mega contractors gets the project and how it's designed. And they were very reluctant to let political appointees in. That became a struggle. But they would say, well, we're the experts, and of course we're not biased. But what we saw is that there's great incest, and you see this also at Department of Defense. A lot of the people who are deciding who gets the contracts have friends in the contractors, and a lot of them, mysteriously a year later get high-paying jobs at the company that they just gave the contract to. So that's a big part of the fraud that people, I think, want to know about.
I think a lot of people in our country and people in our audience are saying, what about the good programs? What about somebody starving? What's going to happen to
yeah,
people that we've been
that's been an issue from the beginning. And they, from the beginning, were issuing waivers for what they called life-saving programs. Now that, again, has become contentious because there's some programs that, is preventing malaria. Is that life-saving? People could dispute that. Or do we really have to give aid in this conflict country where things aren't going there? In general, that's been a principle. Most Republicans and even the Trump administration has agreed to PEPFAR, which is the AIDS program in Africa. I do think there are, well, again, we haven't seen the whole list of what programs are out there. There are some other programs that, and I think some of them will be brought back, because in addition to solving international development, foreign aid can be a tool you use to incentivize people. And if you've been watching, President Trump has been very deft at using carrots and sticks to get things out of other countries. He passed these tariffs, and people were claiming the world's going to explode, but in fact, we get things out of those tariffs. And you can do the same thing with foreign aid. If some country isn't helping us on immigration, we may threaten them, but we may also say, hey, we'll give you a little bit of this foreign aid. So I think we'll see some of that. But part of what, as was mentioned, State Department's going to take this over, because a lot of times aid wasn't coordinated closely, but State Department really sets policy, and so it makes sense for them to be making these decisions.
This is really going to be one of my all-time favorite questions in my tenure in this role, because several of you asked it in different ways, and it's about accountability, but I always ask for short questions, and this one is WTF. When will there be arrests? So I don't know who sent that up, but I like you. When and will there be any accountability for all this?
Yeah, there is. Pete Morocco, about a week ago, did actually say that is now something they're looking at, which I think is hugely important, because, again, there's a lot of terrible things that have happened, and the worst you see is somebody is forced to retire. And, more often it's, take the remedial ethics and we're going to put a letter in your file kind of stuff. So, but this is also a broader problem across the government. In a case I'd like to cite, which is in the book, if you remember, there was the, trying to remember, there was this physician in Michigan State who was molesting the gymnasts. And some FBI guy he informed of this, and he sat on it because he was trying to get a job from the Olympic Committee. And so this delayed the case, and so this guy continued to perpetrate his crimes, and finally he's found out. So they have a hearing on Capitol Hill, and they ask, I believe it was Christopher Wray who's there, another stellar character. So they said, okay, well, this guy just did this heinous act, an FBI official. Are you going to prosecute him? They said, well, he's retired now. And they said, yeah, but you can still prosecute him. They said, well, we don't want to talk about these personnel matters. So that kind of stuff is, insane. And I do think with Kash Patel coming in, I think hopefully you will see some of this, because I think we've seen a lot of malfeasance in the FBI, which is really a shame. Again, if you look back, Crossfire Hurricane, and by the way, if you have Democratic friends, ask them about, I like to always ask them, so what happened with Crossfire Hurricane? Most of them don't even know because it never got covered in liberal media. But you have people like Kevin Kleinsmith who should have gone to jail, or Bruce Orr, or Andy McCabe. So you already have a lot of these people, but most of them have evaded punishment. But I think hopefully that will change under this administration.
I think they'd all look really handsome in orange. Your lawyer comes from a different political party. Your father, in fact, you shared with me, comes from a political party. Would you address that this should not be a partisan issue?
Yeah, I mean, and that was partly why I, ended up hiring a lawyer who was a Democrat, because I was told, well, we'll marshal support from both sides of the aisle. Well, again, we went to Senator Wyden, who's supposed to be the Democrat whistleblower protection guy, and he doesn't want to do anything. And it is a toxic, it's part of the broader view among the Democratic Party that Trump is a deplorable, and everything should be done to stop him, which I think is crazy. I'd say also this isn't the first time we've seen this from the Democrats. I mean, if you go back to the even when George W. Bush was president, you had this sort of toxic politicization, it has formed some interesting alliances. There are, I think, there is an element on the left that's actually sort of sympathetic to some of the stuff that they're seeing now, because some of them also know that the system is corrupt and there are bad people. But I do think it's unfortunate. And again, I said the media, same thing. Like, you think, well, the media they will cover any great corruption story. Well, not now. They won't cover it if it doesn't promote their political agenda.
So there are a number of questions about the role of the CIA, and you kind of alluded to this in the founding of the organization and what the intention was. If this gets cut off, will the CIA funnel money through somewhere else to do what it does?
That's a good question. It reminds me too, there was a question about the NGOs, which I didn't get into. So there was, I do think sometimes this gets a bit convoluted in the press. The CIA working with USAID was closer in the past. I mean, in the 70s, you have a lot of things passed. And so they may talk to each other. They're not really, for the most part, working together, but they are both engaged in some fairly nefarious stuff and pushing money into the wrong places. I mean, the CIA has an easier time, in some extent, moving money. Now, again, you think, well, this is actually another thing that I think was going to get addressed by this administration. There's very few political appointees at the CIA, something like 6 for this massive agency. And if you remember, a guy named John Brennan, who ran the CIA, is about one of the most crooked people I've ever heard of. And we've seen some other bad stuff going on at the CIA. So, and putting money, again, they have a lot of money there, which can easily go in the wrong places. But USAID also has a lot of money that gets pushed to these NGOs, and a lot of them, as I said, we saw a lot of Obama people in 2017, they move right into the NGO world, and there already happen to be grants waiting for them. So they've got this teed up, and I'm pretty sure the Biden people thought they were going to do this too. In 2024, we're going to send all this money to these NGOs, and then we're going to go leave the agency, go work there as consultants, not expecting that all this money was going to get shut off.
All this money teed up, by the way, is all the money that we all work for, right? That you spend hours of your life. I think we work till April 19th for all that money that is teed up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Speaking of how all that works, one of the questions is about the Oval Office. Do you want to guess who's been running the Oval Office for the last 4 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there was a news item on that today, or was it? I think a couple days ago they noticed that all of at least almost everything Biden was doing was signed by an auto pen.
Auto pen, yes. How many of you have an auto pen? No.
So that is a good question. I'm not sure.
How many of you make your grandparents sign documents they don't understand? Okay, two things that are not common in our culture.
Yes, well, it was interesting. We had a period of about 2 weeks where the media, with all these great sources, was telling us about Biden. All of a sudden he's mentally incompetent until he gets kicked out the door, and then they're silent again. And so we're left with not great amount of information. It'd be interesting to know what Hunter Biden spent his time doing there. And that's another great story that the mainstream media has totally punted on and ignored. I think eventually more of the truth will come out eventually.
Mark, how many hours of your life have been sucked out by this persecution?
That's a great question. I haven't kept count, but it would be, for a good part of several years, it was, just created financial problems, mental stress, trying to just figure out. And one of the things too, and I talk about this in the book, whistleblowers in general have a very high rate of mental illness because most of them get treated very poorly. So that's one thing I talk about in the book. How do you kind of deal with this kind of trauma? And that was against some of the things I cite in the one slide, things like family and faith and country, which, again, things that used to be more common to Americans that have been taken away from many people, so things that we need to, I think, restore to our culture.
Speaking of restoring our culture, what can be done to support and strengthen the virtues that you identify that lead to American strength, like patriotism, faith, self-reliance, generosity, thrift, industry? How can we strengthen that?
Yeah, well, when we face, I think something of a crisis in primary and secondary education because we've seen the left take over public education, and so you see a lot of people just pulling their kids out if they can. Unfortunately, that's not an option for a lot of people, and so I think that's something we're going to see now with the new administration. Even just basic things like American civics need to be restored. Kids should actually have to read the Constitution and know their history. And another thing too, I would mention, American history textbooks have been taken over by the left for the most part. One of my fellow Hillsdale professors has a book called Land of Hope, which is what we use to teach our students, and it's taught at some places, but we need to rehabilitate the serious study of history. It's really been taken over by the left. One of the, since Victor Davis Hanson was mentioned, I should say, so he's one of our greatest historians. He's been at Stanford for I don't know, at least 20 years. So they don't let him teach in the history department at Stanford. Nor do they let Neil Ferguson, another great historian, or pretty much any conservative who is there. And so I do think we should also defund
what exactly is Victor doing over there, polishing the floors? They don't let Victor Davis Hanson teach in the history department.
Correct.
I know they don't teach constitutional law in the law school, but this I did not know.
Yeah, he writes, researches. He's on the news a lot. He's written a lot of excellent books, but Yes, when Neil Ferguson showed up too, I mean, he's been a little, made a little more effort recently to try to stay on the good side of these people, but they said he wasn't qualified. Now, he had quit a job at Harvard as a full professor, which he was one of the only conservatives to actually get on the Harvard faculty. But
That's actually funny, Mark. Victor Davis Hanson's not qualified to teach history at Stanford.
Yes. Another fun fact about Stanford History Department, there are more professors than history majors because people don't want to take the crappy history that's being taught. I mean, they don't want to, learn about the things that are being offered there. It's really
wow.
sad.
I could just wind this talk up right there. That's you're not going to say anything more shocking than that. May I ask you just a few more, and then we'll let you get downstairs and sign some books. But Elon Musk. Some of our audience members, one of them says that they're worried about Elon. What can they do to support him? I think other people are suspicious of Elon. What's your take?
Yeah, well, it's, I think we're still learning more about what he's been doing. I mean, he's certainly been great in drawing attention to, I think without him, you don't see USAID getting all the attention, which is what helped drive the actions to correct it. I think ultimately, and we're already seeing it, you do have cabinet officials who are going to have to run these agencies, and so there's a certain tension there between DOJ trying to tear things apart and then agency heads still trying to run the agencies. I think that will eventually get sorted out. I do think there is going to be some pain, and one of the big questions is, do you really have to, if you're going to make massive cuts, you're going to probably, cut some of the wrong people and do some damage to things. And so people are questioning that. On the other hand, the first administration, as I talked about, they tried to nibble around the edges and didn't really get very far. So I think that's why we're seeing the extent of destruction right now.
Okay. Do you think California can be doged?
I certainly hope it can be DOJ. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. I'm still hoping at some point. I spent a lot of my time on Vietnam War, and it is interesting that this state used to be pretty Republican back in the day. So maybe at some point get turned around, and but yeah, I'm guessing this part of California may be the last holdout.
Okay. I know there are veterans in the room, and you have obviously written some really terrific books, particularly focusing on the Vietnam War. You're finishing up the last of the trilogy now. Would you like to share with us where things stand with that book and what to look forward to?
Yeah, the last book is 69 to 75. I would have liked to have it this year because this is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and Hillsdale, we're actually doing several events around that. This will take a bit longer, but it's mostly going to be looking at how the war, could have brought it to a successful conclusion, but then you had Democrats in Congress who decided they were going to pull the plug on aid, which then unfortunately flushed down the drain what we had earned. While at the same time, I do argue that by what we did in Vietnam bought time for other countries in the region to, avoid becoming communist and suffering all the terrible things that go along with being communist.
Yeah. So, Mark, we always ask our speakers what they hope that these people, these patriots, will do tomorrow morning when they wake up with the information that you shared tonight, because we're not here to be entertained. We're not here because nobody wants us home on a Tuesday night, right? We're here to learn and to act and to do. So what would you hope that we could do specifically tomorrow morning when we wake up?
Yeah, well, I think, there's many different ways that people can help, but, in general, I think, it's easy to get so frustrated with the government that you just want to throw your hands up and walk away from it. And, I would like to make the point, we still do need good people to be involved. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a full-time government employee, but there's a lot you can do, can help a campaign, volunteer. And so this is a long-term struggle. You here, I think, probably have more difficulties than most, and we're never going to get change probably at the pace we want, with the possible exception of Doge. And but try to do things to help make the government better, because if we simply all give up, then the government's just going to be even worse than it already is.
Okay. Mark wrote, among the most important reasons for the ineffectiveness of the federal government is its aptitude for alienating and driving out its best people. I hope more people like you will step up and do a short stint in government service with confidence that the culture of corruption is being put in check. Thank you tonight for your program, Mark, and thank you for your perseverance, for standing up what's right on behalf of Americans. Mark Moyar, we very much appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Please like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on new speakers, and consider joining the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley. You can do so at our website. If you don't want to join, but want to support the principles of American liberty, you can make a tax-deductible donation via our website. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and stay free.